Hello, epistemologists. So today we're going to be starting a new unit, and that's really exciting for me and for you, hopefully. And our new unit is going to be about social epistemology, questions with how we interact with each other in a way that affects our ability to know, our justification, and also, maybe a certain amount of our ethical status. So we're beginning by discussing issues having to do with disagreement. Is it possible for two people to rationally disagree? And if you do disagree, what are you supposed to do about it? If you have an epistemic peer who says X and you say Y, should you reconcile? Should you hold fast to whatever it is that you were believing before? And then after we talk about these issues with disagreement, we'll move on and talk about some issues with social justice relating to epistemology. And hopefully near the end of the semester, we will turn it also into a discussion of how epistemology bears on, and these issues, the social issues, bear on building a democratic society and what epistemic principles surrounding that might look like. So hope we're all ready for some action. So we're beginning our unit into social epistemology kind of like slowly. We're dipping in, and we're dipping in with this problem that we're talking about this week on epistemic uniqueness and on epistemic permissivism. And this debate is related to two questions. One question, which is kind of the main question that it's involved in, is what does your evidence support? Does your evidence suppose that you're, I don't know, trying to solve a crime? You're on one of those like crime drama serials, right? And you've got an array of evidence in front of you in the lab or something, and you and an assistant are looking over the objects in front of you, and you come to possess a certain amount of evidence, and you have the same evidence. What does your evidence support? Could your evidence support just one thing, or could it support more than one thing? Right? Potentially, could you come to one conclusion about what the evidence supports and your assistant a different one? Or is that not epistemically allowed? Right? What is rational to believe in light of a certain amount of evidence? And secondly, related to that issue, this problem about what your evidence supports has to do with the bigger issue of whether you're allowed to disagree with someone else on the basis of the same evidence. So if you think that any set of evidence will support only one unique conclusion, then it means that everybody should agree. Anytime that you have the same evidence, you should agree. That's rationally required of you. But according to the other side, the people who think that your evidence might support equally well more than one proposition, more than one conclusion on the basis of the evidence, then on that view, it would be possible for two people to rationally disagree on the basis of the same evidence. So that's kind of the topic for today. And we're starting out with a paper by Roger White entitled Epistemic Permissiveness. And despite the title, he's actually going to be defending a view called uniqueness. Uniqueness is the thesis that given one's total evidence, the total amount of information that you have in your possession, there is a unique, rational, doxastic attitude that you can take, that one can take, to any proposition. So uniqueness is the thesis that there's one unique conclusion you can come to on the basis of a total body of evidence. So it's related to the position that if you have a total body of evidence in common with someone else, you both should agree. That's what's rationally required of you. That's kind of the position of uniqueness. This means, his defense of this thesis means that he's rejecting various forms of permissivism. And permissivism is actually a body of views. It's not just one view, it's a body of views according to which a range of alternative doxastic attitudes may be permissible responses to a body of evidence according to epistemic rationality. So basically, permissivists think that it is permissible to come to more than one conclusion on the basis of the same body of evidence. So the permissivist thinks it's possible and rationally permissible for two people to disagree when they're looking at, when they have the same evidence, the same total evidence. It's important to note. So it might be that if you have some background evidence that you only alone have and the other person doesn't have, then that's not going to be a problem for uniqueness if you disagree about the conclusion you should reach because you have different evidence. So it's only a claim about, given one shared set of evidence, what should you believe? The permissivist thinks maybe there's more than one thing, depending on the scenario, that could be allowed to believe on the basis of the evidence. Another way to think of permissivism is as the view that reasonable people can disagree, or something to that effect, on the basis of the same evidence. Here's a quote from Gideon Rosen. "It should be obvious that reasonable people can disagree, even when confronted with the same body of evidence. When a jury or a court is divided in a difficult case, the mere fact of disagreement doesn't mean that someone is being unreasonable." Unquote. White, however, Roger White, our author for today's paper, writes, quote, "If my current beliefs are not rationally obligatory for me, why should I take propositions that I actually believe as a basis for action and reasoning, rather than some others that I don't believe, but would be rational in believing?" Unquote. White is pointing out a problem with permissivist views that uniqueness views don't have, which is that if I'm a permissivist, what would be the reason for using my own beliefs as opposed to some other hypothetical beliefs I could have acquired on the basis of the evidence that I have? So when you act on the world, you usually make use of the beliefs that you have about what's in the world, right? If I think that there's a chair in the corner, it's possible for me to think about sitting in it and maybe to sit in it. But if I don't have that belief, then I can't sit in the chair because I don't believe there's one there, right? So, take that simple case and apply it to maybe more complicated situations. I usually act on things that I believe, right? And the permissivist leaves open for White that maybe I should be believing what someone else believes because they're allowed to do it. They're rationally permitted to do it. So why should I act on the basis of my own beliefs? Why can't I act on the basis of their beliefs, given that I think both are reasonable? Basically, I'd have no reason to hold on to my own beliefs. And so it would be a very unstable position, White thinks. And he's going to offer a couple of arguments against permissivism. Notice also that in being arguments against permissivism, they're also necessarily, in this case, arguments in favor of uniqueness. So this is White's way of defending uniqueness as the right position to have with respect to what your evidence supports. And here's his first argument. We're going to talk about two, although we'll have two versions of the first one. So here's the first argument, the first version of the argument, and it has to do with a court case. So imagine that I've been put on a jury, and I know that the jury is going to be in charge of considering the evidence that maybe Smith committed a crime, this person Smith. So suppose, premise one, that Smith is being tried for a crime and I am on a jury. Premise two, prior to considering any evidence, we might agree that it would be unreasonable to have an opinion about Smith's guilt. And that makes sense, right? You shouldn't decide a case before hearing the evidence, right? That's just a generally good thing to do, not only in the criminal justice system, but in life in general. Premise three, only evidence supporting his innocence could make it rational to believe he is innocent. And that makes sense, right? So if I have evidence that he's innocent, then it would be rational to believe he's innocent. If I have no evidence that he's innocent, and maybe I have some evidence to believe he's guilty, then it wouldn't be rational to believe he's innocent. So only evidence that supports his innocence could make it rational to believe he is innocent, according to premise three. Premise four, whatever is evidence for P, for some proposition P, is evidence for the falsity of not P. So is evidence against not P. That is to say, any evidence that says, hey, believe this, implicitly also says, kind of, don't believe not this. So any evidence equally bears on the truth of a proposition and the falsity of its contradiction, right? That's premise 4. So, conclusion, the total evidence cannot support both Smith's innocence and his guilt. So, if you buy this argument, it follows that if you can't decide what to believe before considering evidence, and only evidence that favors a proposition can make it rational to believe in that proposition, and anytime you do have evidence in favor of a particular proposition, it's also evidence against its negation, then the total evidence couldn't support both Smith's innocence and his guilt. The evidence will only ever support one half of the two possibilities. It'll either support his innocence or it'll support his guilt. Maybe it could be inconclusive, but that too, right, is a unique position. If the evidence is inconclusive, there's only one right conclusion to come to, which is that you should withhold belief about Smith's guilt, right? Here's the modified version of this argument, and it's a reductio version of the argument. So remember, a reductio is when we assume something that we're fighting about, and we show how taking on that assumption leads to a contradiction, and thus we should drop the assumption. So here's the reductio version of this argument. Premise 1, suppose I think extreme permissivism applies to this case. Extreme permissivism would mean you're allowed to believe Smith is guilty and you're allowed to believe Smith is innocent, given the exact same body of evidence, complete opposite conclusions on the basis of the same evidence. That's extreme permissivism. So suppose I think extreme permissivism applies to this case. Premise 2, if so, then prior to considering evidence, I think it would be reasonable for me to conclude at the end of the process, regardless of the evidence, whether Smith is guilty or innocent. Right? If I think that extreme permissivism allows total opposite conclusions to come from the same evidence, then before I even consider the case, I would think it's reasonable to conclude either thing on the basis of the evidence that I have not yet seen. Premise 3, then it should make no difference how I weigh the evidence. I have no better chance of forming a true belief than if I were to take a random pill that caused me to form a belief. So if what conclusion I come to on the basis of the evidence is kind of a crapshoot, if I'm allowed to believe either that Smith is innocent or that he's guilty, then it's just kind of random what I feel inclined to believe. And it has no bearing on the status of the evidence. I might as well just, get hit on the head to believe something as actually evaluate the evidence. Conclusion, extreme permissivism doesn't make sense. We'll see when we talk about the permissivist defense next time, whether this is a good and convincing argument. But, as a first pass, it's pretty compelling, right? The idea is like, if you thought that you could believe conflicting things on the basis of the same evidence, you're maybe in danger of incoherence. You're maybe in danger of thinking that there's no role for evidence at all, which is not what the permissivist wants. The permissivist isn't just someone who thinks everything's allowed. The permissivist is someone who just thinks that reasonable people can sometimes disagree on the basis of the same evidence. And this kind of extreme upshot of that view would be really bad. So this should make them uncomfortable. Now here's an addendum to this argument, this first argument White gives us against permissivism. If the evidence favors neither conclusion, he says, we should think that the correct attitude is suspension of belief, right? And that's just what I said earlier. So it's not necessary that it just be these two extreme things, either you believe or you don't believe, and then maybe both are the same. If I really think that either believing P would be rational or believing not P would be rational, and both would be rational, there should be nothing wrong with my bringing it about that I have some belief or other, but then it doesn't matter how I choose my belief. So the uniqueness position is the position that if the evidence is equally weighted, the right thing to do is to suspend belief, whereas the permissivist thinks it's not just that the evidence is equally weighted, it's that it's permissible to believe either, P or not P on the basis of that evidence. Or maybe it's also permissible to suspend judgment. So it's almost like it's not giving you any rule whatsoever to follow about what evidence supports. What can we imagine that the permissivist might say in their own defense? Because this is a little harsh. Perhaps permissivism is just a position about other people's beliefs in relation to your own, for example. Maybe it's not applicable to your own beliefs, right? So maybe it's not the case that before the Smith trial, like you're allowed to believe whatever, and so it doesn't even really matter whether you go over the evidence. No. It's just a position about what attitude you should take towards someone else coming to a different conclusion on the basis of the same evidence, which is, according to the permissivist, you should be permissive. You should not think that they're irrational just because you came to a different conclusion. That shouldn't lead you to think that you're irrational either. So permissivism is just a position about how you should have an attitude about other people's attitudes. That's the defense, version 1. Roger White thinks this is ad hoc. Why would a permissive view exempt myself, but not anyone else? He says extreme permissivists should hold that, quote, the usual evidence available to philosophers does not determine whether one should believe or disbelieve extreme permissivism, unquote. So White is basically turning the argument onto the philosophical problem surrounding uniqueness and permissivism. According to the extreme permissivists, we don't have enough evidence to determine one way or another. So according to the extreme permissivists, they have no good, steady reason for holding on to extreme permissivism. According to permissivism, it's just as good to be a uniqueness theorist. So for the uniqueness theorist, it's like, oh, well, the weight is all on my side. Like, you think that it's fine to believe what I believe, but I don't think it's fine to believe what you believe, so you should believe what I believe, basically. Now, a different kind of argument maybe that the permissivist could say in their own defense is something like, suggest that there's maybe some possible standards that are alternative standards that don't have to be so extreme. Suppose that you thought that, there's some rules like only in the cases where you are going to apply a different standard to the evidence than I am, even though we're going to possess the same body of evidence, you use one method for inferring from the evidence and I use a different one. So it's not a difference in our evidence, it's a difference in our standards. But White just thinks, well, can't I just tell a story where you went to one school and they taught you a particular type of inquiry there, and I went to a different school and I was taught a particular kind of inquiry there, and then we come to the same body of evidence and we disagree? That feels kind of arbitrary. If that is the reason why we disagree, just that we were trained by different teachers or something, that shouldn't be a good enough reason to be permissive, right? Because if I went to the school that I went to, I should know that it's totally arbitrary what I happen to believe, because it was just a contingent fact that I was taught this way of inferring from my evidence and you were taught a different way. So for White, it's no different than the place that we were at with the Smith trial. It's just that now there's kind of like a bigger looming background arbitrariness to why I happen to come to a conclusion that you don't come to. And it's not looking better for permissivism, according to White. Now, the third sort of response that the permissivist could give in favor of their own position is that maybe, according to the permissivist, it's just that there's some leeway in the degree to which they believe strongly, the degree of conviction they have about the particular position. So it's not a position that two people could come to opposite conclusions on the basis of the same evidence. Maybe it's just a position that people are allowed to disagree about the strength to which they believe something. And White responds that in that case, there should be nothing wrong with my arbitrarily choosing a degree of conviction. Because if I think as a permissivist that any range from 0.5 to 1 is warranted, any degree of confidence, right, is warranted between 0.5 and 1, then I might as well just toss a coin to decide what degree of conviction I'm going to have about the conclusion that I'm going to come to, because I think it's just as reasonable to have degree of conviction 0.6 as 0.8. So why should I end up with 0.8 as opposed to 0.6? I might as well just let like roll the dice. Let that decide the degree of conviction I have about the proposition. So in summary, given this very first argument, White just thinks that permissivism either isn't coherent, it leads to contradictions, or maybe it sounds more reasonable, but it now introduces arbitrariness into our inferential process, into our summing up process, or coming to conclusions about our evidence. And it doesn't feel like there's an epistemic oomph to why either person comes to the conclusion that they do. It's just arbitrary. And epistemology isn't supposed to be the kind of thing that just says, oh, any old position is fine. We're supposed to have a little bit more guidance than that if we want a normative theory, a theory that tells us what we should believe. And kind of White is just objecting that permissivism introduces so much arbitrariness into the theory that it stops being normative in the right way. It's not telling us anything about what to do, and so it kind of comes apart from justification. So pretty serious argument. Now, but remember, that was just our first argument against permissivism. White has a second argument against permissivism that is worth taking a look at. So here's the second argument. If we reject uniqueness, says White, suppose we want to go for permissivism, he says it's going to be hard to see, quote, why one's convictions ought always to be responsive to confirming evidence, unquote. And in order to explain what this means, we're going to have to sort of think through an example because it's a little confusing put that way. So suppose that you and I are both detectives and we're both working a crime scene on Monday. And the crime scene has a certain number of objects in it. And so we come to have a certain body of evidence, a certain set of beliefs about what happened. And suppose that our body of evidence on Monday supports at least the preliminary conclusion that it wasn't an old lady who did it. So we both think that it's unlikely an old lady did it, but you are less confident that an old lady didn't do it than I am. So what might be helpful is to talk about these things we call credences, which are degrees of belief. And degrees of belief are usually some number between 0 and 1. So 1 means you're absolutely certain it's necessarily true or something like that. 0 is you think it's impossible. And most people will probably have credences in between those two. So 0.1 will be it's very, 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 very unlikely, but maybe it's possible. And 0.9 is like it's very, very, very likely and not quite necessary, but it's really hard for it not to be true. So suppose that we are at this crime scene on Monday and we have the same body of evidence and we both think it's unlikely that an old lady did it. And you have credence 0.4 that an old lady did it. That is, you think it's less likely than that it is. So you don't think that it's a better than chance that it's going to be an old lady. You think it's unlikely to be an old lady. But I have credence 0.2. So I think it's even less likely that it was an old lady. So we have that disagreement in terms of our credences, but we otherwise agree that it's unlikely that an old lady did it. I just am less confident than you. And the permissivist thinks that's allowed, right? Because we're allowed to have different credences on the basis of the same body of evidence if you're a permissivist of a particular stripe. So suppose now that on Tuesday, we learn something that we did not know on Monday. Maybe we find that the person who committed the crime is like really tall and they probably had to be really limber. Maybe we find like a fingerprint on the second floor balcony and somehow the person who committed the crime had to jump from the first floor onto the second floor. That makes it way less likely that it was an old person who committed the crime. And so we both adjust our credences down. So you adjust your credence down from 0.4 to 0.2, say, and I adjust my credence down from 0.2 to 0.05. So I'm like now all but convinced that it wasn't an old lady, and you have the credence that I did have myself on Monday. So you now think it's very unlikely. Not just unlikely, but very unlikely that an old lady did it. Now, this is on Tuesday. White asks the question, if the degree of doubt that I had before on Monday would have been rational for me back then. So if the degree of doubt that you had, 0.4, would have been rational for me on Monday, right? Because I'm a permissivist, I think both you are rational and I am rational because we're epistemic peers, we have the same evidence. And we both adjusted down so that now you have the credence that I had. Doesn't that make me wonder whether my lower credence now is maybe mistaken? Like, maybe I should wonder whether maybe my credence initially was the right one to have, or it's like more accurate because that's the one you have now and I had it too, and now I have an even lower credence. Maybe the right credence is the one that I had on Monday that you now have on Tuesday. Why prefer my new credence of 0.05 over my old credence of 0.2, given that you just came to the credence 0.2, basically? It's a little bit like, and this is not what Roger White says, but this is sort of how I think about it. It's a little bit like if you only have two watches and they say a slightly different time from each other and you don't know which one's correct. Like, on what basis would you follow what watch 2 says as opposed to what watch 1 says, or vice versa? It just gets really confusing. Like, how can you act like on whatever time it is if you're not sure which of the times is the correct time? Like, you're pretty sure one of them is right, but you have no way of telling which one's right. That's kind of the position White thinks that the permissivist is in when they and their friend disagree about what the evidence supports. It's like, I don't know if I'm the broken watch or if you're the broken watch. We're both rational, so it's like we're both allowed to be disagreeing watches, but being disagreeing watches doesn't help us move through the world. You know, we want one time. So we would like to know which of us is more accurate. And that's possible with clocks. So why can't it be possible with evidence and what you should conclude on the basis of your evidence? One further question now, before I conclude for today. We might ask what the relationship is between the rule that a certain belief set or a certain action epistemically is allowed and the rule that that action or belief set or function is obligatory. All right, what's the difference between being permitted and being obligated to believe something? So the permissivist isn't saying that it is obligatory in every case to allow multiple positions. The permissivist just thinks it's permissible to have one of maybe a couple of allowable positions. So it's not obligatory, the permissivist is saying, to believe only one of the 2 or 3 or 4 possibilities that are permissible. So the permissivist wants to say that obligation and permission are not the same, right? However, for White, if you're obligated to believe something, you can't be permitted to believe something else. So for him, obligation and permission are intertranslatable in kind of a similar way. If you've done metaphysics or philosophy of language, maybe you know about this, in kind of the similar way that necessity and possibility can be interdefined. So something is necessary if it's not possible for it not to be true, and something is possible if it is not necessary that it not be true. So basically, if you think that obligation means that something else isn't permitted, that is, doing anything else other than the thing that you're obligated to do isn't permitted, then they're not going to be able to come apart. They're not that different. So for White, that distinction between what's obligatory and what's allowed seems to kind of not really be possible, whereas the permissivist wants it to be possible. So that could be something to think about for next time. Is there a way for the permissivist to make that distinction and make some room for their position that doesn't end up sounding unreasonable and doesn't end up sounding arbitrary, and still makes it be the case that we agree that it can be rational to disagree about what the evidence supports? So that's it for today. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk about this more next time. Bye, everyone.